Today is Bastille Day in France, and the usual military parade took place in Paris, commemorating the 1789 storming of the Bastille military fortress. That was so revolutionaries could secure gunpowder and weapons to defend themselves against a feared royal military crackdown. Of course, this evening, the French will have a new defensive fortress to overcome, that of the Spanish national football team, who have conceded only one goal in the entire World Cup so far. Don't worry, this is not going to be a segment about footballing tactics and strategy. You'd be in the wrong place for that. Especially also as by the time many of you watch this as a segment, the outcome might already be known to that game. Instead, we're looking at the politics surrounding the French football team, and there is a lot to talk about. So most obviously, in a country with a surging far right, the highest ranked team in the world does not look like the ethnically homogenous France Marine Le Pen's national rally might like to hark back to. So the majority of the squad at the World Cup come from immigrant backgrounds, with the team reflecting France's colonial history in North and West Africa. And most notably, France's captain and top goal scorer is this man, Kylian Mbappe. His dad was born in Cameroon. His mum's of Algerian descent. Mbappe, in this World Cup was subject to some pretty severe racism, though not from France's far right, but this time from a Paraguayan politician. So French prosecutors opened an investigation into Celeste Amarilla, a senator in Paraguay's parliament, who lashed out at Mbappe on Instagram after her national team, Paraguay, lost out to France. So Amarilla described Mbappe as, quote, a colonized Cameroonian desperately trying to pass himself off as French, and as, quote, a brute who had not learned to write. That's from a politician. She has been censured by the Paraguayan parliament, so Paraguay don't want to see themselves as represented by this person, has also been condemned across the political spectrum in France. So it's not as if the National Rally have said, aha, this Paraguayan politician is right, because that would be electoral suicide, presumably. Ahead of today's semi-final, though, racism is coming from closer to home. So this is really crazy, because when I was living in Spain, he was the prime minister, a very significant guy. So Spain's former prime minister, Mariano Rajoy, this week wrote in a newspaper column that the French World Cup team is playing without Frenchmen. It's not too long since racist tirades were thrown at leading French footballers from within France's own political elite. So at the 2006 World Cup, Jean-Marie Le Pen, so Marine Le Pen's father, the then leader of the National Front, said that France, quote, cannot recognize itself in the national side, and that, quote, maybe the coach exaggerated the proportion of players of color and should have been a bit more careful. So that's Jean-Marie Le Pen in 2006. Now, his daughter Marine is not foolish enough to make such explicit attacks against the current French national football team. Her aim has been to try and detoxify the national rally, even giving it that new name. Whether or not anyone should believe her is a different question. The far-right party, though, is not getting a free ride from Les Bleus. So in May this year, Mbappe said he was worried about what a national rally victory would mean for France. He told Vanity Fair, quote, I know what it means and what kind of consequences it can have for my country when these kinds of people take control. So with a surging far right in France, what is the significance of a successful and ethnically diverse French football team? Well, I spoke earlier to Dr. Andrew Smith, a historian of modern France at Queen Mary University.
The French men's football team has traditionally been a vehicle, a champion for a certain vision of France. Way back in 1998, when France won the World Cup, it was presented as a black, blanc, beurre. The black, white, and beurre is the kind of Verlan word for Arab, that kind of united this idea of a diverse France. And that kind of was a real vision of, a post-colonial France, a diverse France that worked. And it's often been seen as a champion for that type of diversity. And that's something that's happened quite a lot recently as well, with a number of clashes already this World Cup between various politicians, especially South American politicians, and Kylian Mbappe, of course, the kind of leader of the French team.
I wanted to ask about that clash, because in 2006, I know, some of the racism towards the French team came from within French politics. So Jean-Marie Le Pen bemoaned the number of black players in 2006. I assume his daughter, Marine Le Pen, it wouldn't be stupid enough to sort of open up that debate from within her party again, or am I wrong?
Absolutely, you're right. In terms of Jean-Marie Le Pen, he talked about people being kind of, paper Frenchmen, the idea of, questioning people's citizenship. And really that was dog whistle politics about just blatant racism and the colour of people's skin. People at the time pushed back. Of course, famous players like Liliane Thuram challenged him vocally in the press, and people rallied to the side of the football team. Now, Marine Le Pen hasn't pushed anything like that, but there have been clashes with the current French team. Back in 2024, after the snap election was called, when President Macron dissolved Parliament, Kylian Mbappe encouraged people not to vote for the extremes. And Jordan Bardella, who's the young second in command behind Marine Le Pen, kind of hit back at him, saying that, wealthy people shouldn't tell citizens how to vote. There's a bit of back and forth there. But really, the far right in France has tried to box a little bit more clever in terms of its approach to the French national team, especially when they're winning.
And so does that mean they are, the National Front are sort of trying to rally around the flag, and I suppose they want to be associated with the French team. I'm not sure if the French team want to be associated with them.
Yeah, 100%. I think we've seen before already, back in 2024, as I said, you got Mbappe kind of criticising people voting for the extremes. There were other players at the time, like Marcus Thuram came out, echoing those thoughts as well. They really paint themselves, the football team present themselves as being kind of a winning mentality, they see themselves as facing off against all comers. But there was a storm already in terms of the former Spanish Prime Minister criticised them again, questioning, much like Jean-Marie Le Pen did way back in 2006, the nationality of some of these players, whether or not they're really French and all the rest of it. But unanimously, right across the French political spectrum, people have hit back at it, calling it racism, just saying this is not an acceptable thing to talk about in this moment. So I think, the French political spectrum is all for the French national team. There was a bit of doubt beforehand, before the tournament started. Mbappe was seen as being a little bit overconfident, maybe he'd gone on a bit of a dry spell, all this kind of stuff. But there was a huge petition, essentially, a signed open letter from French people apologising to Mbappe for his, for lacking confidence in him beforehand, an apology to the captain, an encouragement to drive him forward.
I know you're a historian, you're not a football analyst, but you are sort of a close follower of France, I suppose, and a football fan as well. So, lots of people are asking, why does France so consistently produce sort of incredible world-class footballers? Because it's not just the French team at this World Cup. I think there's almost 100 players at this World Cup who were born in France. So obviously there's lots of people in France who have a background in a different country. FIFA, their rules means that you can sort of play for any team if your grandparent was from there. So there are some people who can choose 4 teams who they play for. And many people who were born in France have now gone on to play for, the country of their mother or father or whatever. What is it about France that means that they just pump out these incredible footballers?
I think there's a lot of consistent state support for grassroots football, an encouragement of trying to draw them in to the football system from a young age. You've got elite clubs, like rich clubs like PSG, of course, but a good standard throughout Ligue 1 as well. Football is one of these games that is, often played by, younger, poorer men, boys that are grown up in neighbourhoods in the banlieue, as it gets called in France. The idea of the quartier populaire, working class areas of cities, where people are playing their way out. They're trying to get ahead. They're pushing for something which, they can excel in by their own talent, not held back by, social structures of racism, like the disadvantage that affects them in various other ways. So really, I think one of the things we can see is that the concentration of people trying to kind of push their way to better their station is one of the reasons that, this diverse country of France, it's a huge post-colonial nation. The French Empire, of course, was absolutely vast, slightly different from the British Empire, and that a lot of places were legitimately considered to be part of France, of course, like Algeria right up until 1962. But even now, France has copious sort of overseas territories, these crumbs of empire scattered throughout the Pacific Ocean, throughout the kind of Indian Ocean, places where there are still overseas departments, overseas regions. So I think really, why does France produce these players? It's because of the systems that supports better footballers, communities of working class kids trying to play their way into the kind of, into fortune, basically, but also these post-colonial legacies where France is still marked by those legacies of empire. It really is a post-colonial nation that needs to reckon with those types of kind of social attitudes, I think.
And just because I know some of our audience's ears might have pricked up when you sort of said, we're legitimately considered part of France. I suppose you want to just expand by what you mean by that. Sort of, I suppose
it was considered territorially part of France. If you imagine, the idea of the Mediterranean was considered at the time as like the two banks of the Seine, So Algeria was divided into 3 départements. They were considered French territory. It was not a separate country which was owned by France, but it was viewed by the French state as being part of France. So legitimately, I mean, considered by law. It was, of course, part of the reason for the brutality of Algeria's war for independence stemmed from the fact that it was considered not a war, but an internal policing action by the French state, which led to some of the real brutality, the use of torture, the extraordinary crimes that Emmanuel Macron acknowledged were committed during that war. So that's what I mean, really that kind of odd territorial legacy of its entanglement with France.
I mean, I was watching YouTube videos about sort of why France creates such good footballers today. And there was a clip of Thierry Henry sort of saying that it's a bit like sort of music, in the sense that sort of if you're from a working class area, which is often sort of majority ethnic minority, and there aren't many avenues for you to advance in sort of business or politics or whatever, then the 2 routes out are football or music. And that's why, sort of, in his words, sort of so many people have gone on to become brilliant footballers from France's banlieues. And I mean, there's a way in which that potentially suggests that actually this isn't necessarily the most positive story in the world, because France does seem to, sort of compared to Britain, have much lower social mobility when it comes to ethnic minorities into politics, into the sort of higher levels of business. So is potentially, in an odd way, the success of the French football team in part because of the ghettoization of working class immigrant communities in France?
It's an interesting point. So remember, the French system is, the French Republic is universalist rather than multicultural. What that means is that as a function of, the legacy of the revolution, the attempt to look at, equality and fraternity, it's the idea is the French state doesn't see color or race. It sees French citizens. And so the French state is technically blind to color, blind to religion, all of these kind of things. Now, actually, what that does often is conceal much larger social inequalities. So you get people, talk about laïcité, this idea that you don't have a state religion. Now, someone wearing a headscarf is much more likely to hear about ideas of laïcité than someone who's a nun, for example. What does that say? It says there are lingering kind of social attitudes where actually this is a really negative thing. We can see that already. There are various surveys that talk about how, for example, having a name which might come from North Africa sets you back in terms of job applications. There's very little positive discrimination or ideas of that type of equality legislation that comes in the same way in terms of monitoring different shares of people. And that can lead to some very, very bad outcomes. There are there has been various attempts to challenge this. You go right back into history from 1983, the Marche pour l'égalité contre le racisme, the Marche des Beurs, it was called, which was really about kids and community groups from Lyon challenging the idea of the French state's racism, pushing against it. You've seen various movements between that, SOS Racisme, which became sort of institutionalized perhaps. Then other groups like Indigènes de la République, which challenge this idea and say that people are mistreated within the idea of the state, treated as if they're put on reserves, and that idea of ghettoization, as you spoke about. So there's really a long history of anti-racism in France, which has a lot of work to do and continues to push back against some quite negative social attitudes. Some of those can get disguised by the idea that the headline of universalism. But in reality, I think there are still a lot of problems still to come. And you're right, the idea of that dominance of the football team is in some ways a great story, a wonderful story for 14 Juillet, for Bastille Day, but it's also something which speaks to that being the only route out for some people, for kids that really don't have those other options that many of their peers would if they grew up called something like Francois in, a nice bit of Paris, for example, rather than the banlieue.
Finally, just looping back to sort of politics without the football, is Marine Le Pen, obviously she's just been sort of quite recently been given the right to run in the election, although she's going to have a tag on her ankle. Is she still the favourite to become French president next year?
Yes, the convict candidate. She is still in the leading place in terms of all the opinion polls. But actually, one of the things that people were saying in the run-up to her sentence being reduced on appeal was that in many opinion polls, it was seen that Bardella was perhaps the stronger candidate for the National Rally. He's younger, he's seen as less tarred by that name. Marine Le Pen has, of course, there's this language of detoxification. I think it's really important to state that's not analysis. That's been a deliberate comm strategy by the National Rally to try and detoxify themselves. So they've tried to kind of remove all those old kind of associations with Jean-Marie Le Pen, but the name is still there. There's still that association that you scrape beneath the surface and you're really getting back to the kind of old style kind of far-right, racist, fascist organizations just beneath the surface. So there is a lot there to do. And one of the things that Marine Le Pen's trying to do is she's trying to keep Bardella right next to her at every single rally, at every single thing. Now, she will push. She leads right now. But I think one of the things to point out is that with the opinion polls, we're still a long way out. It'll be April, then May for the second round. And it is not clear who many of the other candidates will be. So especially in polling at this stage, the National Rally has a slight advantage because there is more clarity about who the candidate will be. And so that means there's more name recognition from the public. But that can create momentum. And it's important to challenge that as well and say there is still a lot of race yet to be run. September is going to be very interesting for French politics as we start to get much more clarity about who the opponents will be in the actual presidential race.